All right, hello everybody. It looks like that the pace at which people are joining has slowed, so I'm taking that as an indication that virtually all of us who are joining this webinar on rice are here. So why don't we begin? My name is Drew Schindel. I am a professor back at Duke University in the United States, but I'm on sabbatical now and working with the Climate and Clean Air Coalition as their special advisor, I believe it's called, for methane action. And of course, one of the areas that is in need of action within many sources of methane emissions is rice. So I'm very pleased to open this webinar where today we'll discuss primarily government actions and how those government actions can help us to provide the needed mitigation that reduces methane mitigation from the rice sector. So we've got a great lineup of guests here. You can see the agenda there on your screen now. I believe we're going to deviate ever so slightly from this agenda in that our U.S. State Department representative is delayed, and so we will you'll have to suffer with me for opening remarks because I'm the second one here on the giving an introduction anyway. So I will say a few words to introduce the topic, why we care about methane in general, why we care about rice sector methane in particular, and then we will hear from practitioners and experts who can tell you a lot about how we'll actually get the kind of mitigations that scientists like me can look at in an idealized way, but how do we actually get them on the ground? So we have two guests who I will introduce when we begin the country presentations from different parts of the world with substantial rice cultivation. And then we have a third guest who's no longer a country presenter, but somebody from UNEP who will tell us about monitoring, reporting, and verification of methane emissions. We will then have time at the end for a panel discussion where we will be joined by our fourth and final of the presenter guests, also from UNEP, and that will also give you all who are participating online a chance to ask questions to any of the panelists and to engage in what we hope will be a lively and interesting discussion for all of us. So we have about an hour and 22 minutes left. That should give us plenty of time for a nice panel discussion there towards the end. So to go ahead when we get to that discussion there, for those of you who are not quite as familiar with WebEx, and given that all of these various platforms that we're all using nowadays are all a little bit different from one another, we just wanted to remind you that when we get to the Q&A, the question and answer session, if you can click where it says there for the Q&A button, that's how you will be able to and ask your questions. You can select all panelists and ask everybody there, and you can check responses under my Q&A. If we go to the next, perfect. We can also raise your hand if you would like to have an oral intervention and ask your question out loud. Please, if you do that, remember to lower your hand afterwards so that we don't get confused with what people are now calling legacy hands or old hands, etc. This, as it says there on the slide, this is only available on the desktop and not the browser-based app. So you may not have the option to raise your hand. If not, you could also type the raise my hand into the Q&A, and we'll try to keep an eye on that. So with that, I'm going to just go straight into the introduction. I already said who I am, and I said that reducing methane is important, but really, why is methane reductions, why are they so important? One of there are really three main reasons I would argue that reducing methane is critically important. One is that reducing methane contributes to meeting the Paris Agreement and our long-term goal of keeping warming well below 2 degrees with an eye towards 1.5. And in fact, in the assessment that we did under CCAC earlier this year, we showed that to get down to a 1.5 degree consistent scenario, we needed to act very rapidly and to make very major reductions. And that included reducing our emissions of methane, the anthropogenic portion, by 45% by the end of this decade. So just think about that for a moment. That's a little under 10 years and reducing emissions almost by half. That's for the long-term goal. Now, the other two things that are very important and argue for immediate and rapid action on methane are that we also get a very pronounced and clear short-term, near-term benefit. So it doesn't mean that we don't get that long-term benefit. That's there too. But unlike when we deal with longer-lived greenhouse gases, where the benefits are only in the long term, by reducing methane, we get a long-term climate benefit, but we also get a really important near-term benefit. And when you think about all of the consequences we're seeing now with heat waves, with disruption in monsoon rainfall, with wildfires in Europe and Australia and North America, et cetera, there are just so many very severe impacts happening now that while we obviously care greatly about the welfare of future generations and would like to commit to and reach the Paris goal, it also is vital to reduce the damages being felt over the next few decades. And methane is the strongest lever we have to do that. You can see on the slide around 0.3 of a degree warming avoided by 2040 if we get our methane emissions down to this 1.5 degree path. That is far more than we can get in the near term from any other mitigation that's possible. And then the last thing that's so wonderful about reducing methane is because methane is a precursor to tropospheric ozone, it also brings us cleaner air with enormous consequences, which you can see there for public health, over 250,000 deaths avoided every year, starting 2030, right? There would be some even in the ramp up as emissions go down, but by 2030 already, we'd have this 250,000 fewer deaths, 26 million tons of crops, billions of hours of lost work exposure. That's due primarily to reduced heat exposure, so starting in around 2040. And all of these things make it economically and ethically and for the sake of food security, for the sake of human well-being, attractive to reduce methane. And not even just attractive, that's too mild a word, but vital to reduce methane. If I could have the next slide, please. I'm going to just wrap up this introduction by saying a little more about how we get to 45% reduction. Really, you won't be surprised to hear we do everything, right? We reduce emissions from fossil fuels, from oil and gas, from coal. We reduce emissions from the waste sector, primarily municipal waste, and we reduce emissions from the agricultural sector, which includes livestock, it includes manure, and it includes our topic of the day, rice. Right? To get such a steep reduction, you can see in the graph there on the right, methane's been shooting up. We want a U-turn, we want it to come down as rapidly as it's been going up. That requires everything on the table. So the current emissions from rice, as it is shown there, around 30 million tons per year, fairly narrow uncertainty range compared to some of the other sources. The abatement potential has been estimated by a number of teams around the world, governments and academic researchers. And again, a fairly narrow range, especially compared with many of the other sources, like, say, livestock, where there's much more uncertainty. Here, all of the research teams agree it's roughly 6 to 9 megatons, so around 7.5 plus or minus a very small percentage could be eliminated of those emissions by the end of this decade. That would be a very important contribution to this overall 45% reduction. And getting methane reductions of 45%, there's this really interesting link with rice, and that rice both emits methane, but the methane that then, the ozone that's then formed from that methane, as I mentioned, affects the rice yields. So by reducing methane emissions, we would also improve our rice yield. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about how the interventions, the different types of, for example, alternate wetting and drying affect rice yields, but this is a large global effect from the reduction in methanes that were consistent with 1.5 degrees. That would itself lead to increases in rice. So with that kind of background, I hope I've given you a little bit of a sense of why we in the CCAC and the many countries that have now joined the Global Methane Pledge, trying to put these kind of findings into action, that we really need very rapid and deep reductions on our methane emissions this decade, why we think this is so important. We're going to transition now into the country presentations. And our first guest is going to be, as you can see here, I apologize in advance, Dr. Tran, if I mispronounce your name, Dr. Tran Dai Nia, who is Director of the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Economic Studies, also heads the Climate Change and REDD+ research group at the Institute of Policy and Strategy for Agriculture and Rural Development. And Dr. Tran is currently leading a number of climate change projects, as well as reviewing policies and providing advice for policymakers. These projects include several that are related to rice. So we are thrilled to have you with us today, Dr. Tran, and we are excited to hear both about your experiences in Vietnam, about where we might go in the future with those, and how you have worked with the Vietnamese government on national action planning, and how we can reduce methane from the rice sector. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you very much for joining.
Good afternoon, and maybe good morning for our colleagues from the other side of the sphere. Thank you, Dr. Drew Sidia, for the introduction. So I will present to you today and share the Vietnamese experience on the government action in reducing the methane emission from rice cultivation and how that's related to the policy and development. And you can see that this agriculture still play very important roles in the economic growth and development of Vietnam still. And you can see from my presentation, we also, the agriculture contribute a lot for the export. We are among the, I think, top 5 of different commodity for export. Last year, even the COVID-19, we still have the export turnover is of the more than 41 billion US dollars. And among those, rice still, and we produce about 45 million tons of rice a year. So it's, I think, second largest rice exporter in the world. And for the emission, you can see from the picture that is the total emission from Vietnam is about 106 million plus million tons of CO2 equivalent is from the methane emission. So of which agriculture play contribute the biggest share, about 62%. For the numbers, about 66.54 million tons of methane emission. That is the inventory in 2016. So 3 sectors contributing for the methane, but it's we have the energy, outflow, and waste. But outflow is playing the big role. The number one is in terms of the methane emission in Vietnam. And for within the outflow sectors, rice is contribute for the 75%, equivalent to the 49.7, close to 49.7 million tons of the carbon dioxide equivalent from the methane. The other also including the ethnic fermentation or the manure management from livestock sector. This is still within the livelihood. And so, and for the NDC of Vietnam, we are targeting, you can see from the different agriculture, we targeted using the unconditional commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emission about 6.8 million tons of the CO2 equivalent. You can see from previous, that also means mostly coming from the methane emission. So we're cutting, reducing greenhouse gas emission in the agriculture sector also means reducing the methane emission from agriculture sector in particular, or the affluent in general. So we have, you see from the picture, that is with the conditional and unconditional, with the support from international community. We even increase the cuts up to the 25.8 or 26 million tons of CO2 equivalents, mostly coming, it's the form of the methane. So related to the policy development, we have the core of the policy development is national climate change strategies. So within this strategy, we also have both mitigation section and also adaptation section. And together with in the strategies is a new agriculture strategy towards we call the food system transitioning toward the bioecological food system, with the theme of the high added value, but also towards the neutralize the carbon emission somehow in the future. And you can see we also now at the national level, we have developed, we call the degrees, the government degrees on the GHG emission mitigation and also ozone protection. And within the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development sectors, we also in the process of the completing the new strategies for the period from 21 to 30. And with the same, we are integrating or mainstreaming the commitment of the NDC and also with the National Adaptation Program, together with the achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and targets. So all of this is centered around the adapting or the responsible agriculture commodity with a climate change responsible, and that comply with the government development master plans or the strategies, specify the policy and priorities and measure, and being integrated in the different kinds of the policy framework, for instance, the sub-sector strategies, subsector planning and budgeting frameworks, or subnational planning, local socio-economic development plans, investment and trade promotion, resource mobilization, and private and public partnership in implementing our commitment. So in order to select different policy priorities in agriculture planning framework, we center around the mitigation and adaptation with the 4 or 5 different key criteria. We have the co-benefit, taking into account the responsible to the climate change, economy and society, environmental, institutional and multiple stakeholders, private sectors, inclusive development. And also related, the second also very important, because we have the close to 10 millions of different small farmers. So the economic feasibility for any mitigation or adaptation action, the cost analysis, the cost effectiveness, or require upfront costs of break-even point, payment periods, and whether that we following the scenario of conditional or unconditional mitigation. And then the third one is about scalability and the technical feasibility for the small household holders or the cooperative levels, minimum or the enterprise. And then we also technical feasibility for different ecological and nature-based solution. And also important for the any mitigation actions, we need to have that we call the inevitable action, taking priority for the inevitable action so that we can have the national or sub-national along the different down scales up decentralized to the value chain level. For the methane reduction measures apply in the upflow sector, you can see from my picture, you have the three different subsectors, land use, forest and land use changes, crop production and livestock production. So in the LULUCF one, we're focusing on the controlling forest fire or the savanna burning, controlling it by applying different suitable. We focus on rice production and cultivation. As you see, from 70% of methane is coming from the rice cultivation. So a lot of series of the measures will be implemented. As Dr. Drew mentioned, it's about like a AWD, it's a more permanent. And then we have like also the system of rice incentive system. Then we have also one mass fire reduction, reducing the input, using the more effective of the national input and mid-season drainage, and converting from the rice or 3 rice crop a year into the rice shrimp or the rice fish, so that can reduce the number the rice season per year. And also like managing or controlling recycling of straw of rice, so that we can also reducing from burning the straw or keeping the biomass on the fields to causing the problem with the methane emission. So with rice sector also other crop we can see also from the savanna, but I think today the topic is within the rice sector, so we focus on specific option for the methane reduction in rice sector. So from this, we see that is some way forwards to combining and how to integrating the reducing of methane into the policy development framework, like develop a new agriculture and rural development sector strategies to achieve the sustainable agriculture in line with the Paris Agreement goals and toward the CO2 neutralization and the sustainable development goals. And also feasibility, possibility of joining US, European Union and also US new methane production pledge. And must also endorsing the CCAC 2030 strategy at its high-level working group in December 2020 as paving the way to implementing its methane reduction commitment. So thank you for the listening. Back to you, Dr. Andrew. Drew.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nia. That was very informative and very useful to see how this is going forward. I am expecting, by the way, for anybody who wondered it, as I did briefly, at the difference in the numbers that I showed in the introduction, and we just saw that the conversion to CO2 equivalent is increasing everything by on the order of 25 to 30. So just if you had it in your head, that would be the source of two different numbers, whether it's CO2 equivalent or methane directly. So terrific. Thank you again. And let us go on to our next country presenter. We're going to move a little ways westward within Asia to Bangladesh, and we have Dr. SM Mufiul Islam from Bangladesh, who is a senior scientist and the head of the Bangladesh Rice Research Institute, their regional station in Satkhira, Bangladesh. He has been working on fertilizer and water management and their effects on nitrogen use efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions, and has published on all of these topics in both international and national journals, as well as national proceedings. So we're very excited to have you join us today, Dr. Islam, and over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Honorable Session Chair, distinguished participant. Good afternoon. This is the pictorial view under AWD irrigation, from where we collected gas samples and to measure methane emissions. Now some background information. Rice is the staple food of nearly 50% of the world population, and it is the main food of about 160 million people of this country. And this rice cultivation has been considered a significant source of greenhouse gas emission, particularly methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide. It should be noted that carbon dioxide is not a big concern in rice cultivation due to its emission and uptake almost zero. However, agriculture contributes about 40% of total GHG emission in the world. In addition, rice cultivation alone contributes 10% of total GHG emission globally. However, we have some action plan. Despite being a high vulnerable country to climate change in Bangladesh contributes less than 0.3% of total GHG emission in the world. Nonetheless, Bangladesh wants to active player in the global network to reduce future GHG emission. However, most of the national action plans address climate smart agriculture that helps to reduce methane emissions. First one is Bangladesh National Action Plan. Here is focusing on dissemination of climate smart technology, that is alternate wetting and drying. Second one is nationally determined contribution, NDC. We have a target and we are expecting to reduce methane emission by 70% in 2030 compared to business as usual scenario. Another is Bangladesh Delta Plan 21st Century. Here we are focusing promoting improved technology, that is fertilizer displacement, alternate wetting and drying irrigation like this. And we have this is our national agriculture policy, and this policy based on climate smart agriculture for the reduction of sustainable agriculture, in addition reduction of GHG emission. First one is environment friendly technology. Second one is natural resource management, that is fertilizer displacement. Another is irrigation efficiency. Here we focusing is alternate wetting and drying irrigation. And finally, conservation agriculture that helps reduce methane emission. Now the mitigation option of methane emissions followed in Bangladesh: water management, fertilizer management, rice varieties, conservation agriculture, and finally improvement of existing cropping pattern. Now the effects of irrigation regime on methane emission. AWD irrigation reduced about 37% greenhouse gas emission compared to continuously flooded condition. In addition, the potentiality of this technology, if we extrapolate this technology about 50% of this area, we can mitigate about 4 million ton carbon dioxide equivalent compared to existing on. It should be noted that the total area under AWD condition about 20% of Boro rice area in Bangladesh. Another technology is fertilizer displacement on methane emissions. Across the irrigation regime, urea displacement significantly reduced methane emission compared to farmers' practice, meaning pre-yield urea. Now the potentiality of this technology, if we disseminate this technology, about 50% of area we can mitigate 4 million ton carbon dioxide equivalent GHG emission compared to farmers' practice. Another technology, rice cultivars on methane emissions. Most of the farmers in our country used longer duration rice varieties compared to short duration rice varieties. Due to government interventions, now farmers are using short duration rice varieties, that is Birijan 28. This is short duration rice varieties. Birijan 28 reduced about 20% methane emission compared to longer duration rice varieties. And in addition, the potentiality of this technology, if we extrapolate this technology about 50% area, we can mitigate 2 million ton carbon dioxide equivalent GHG emission compared to farmers' practice. That means compared to existing one. Another technology is conservation agriculture. This is one of the important technology, and it reduced methane emission about 20% compared to conventional practice. Final improvement of existing cropping pattern. Most of the farmers in Bangladesh, they follow Boro, fallow, and Tiamun season. And in case of Boro, farmers use mainly longer duration rice varieties, and in case of wet seasons, farmers also used longer duration rice varieties. But if we incorporate short duration rice varieties in dry season and wet season, in addition, between two rice crops, if we install a non-rice crop, that is mustard, we can reduce the methane emission at least 20% compared to farmers' practice. In addition, this technology helps to increase rice equivalent yield about 20% compared to farmers' practice. Now the farmers' activities under AWD practice. Both public sector, private and NGO introduced AWD as a pilot program in Bangladesh in 2004. In northern and southern part of Bangladesh, particularly Mymensingh, Rockpur, Rajshahi and Chittagong regions. They organized several farmers training, focus group discussion, field day, national workshop, stakeholder meeting, etc. With the technical support of focal area network in the northern part of Bangladesh. Dr. Ahmed Salahuddin, he is the representative of focal area network on northern part of Bangladesh. Now the farmers thinking about AWD, most of the farmers in Bangladesh, they think AWD is a very good technology regarding rice yield, irrigation efficiency, and climate smart agriculture. That means yield increase about 50 to 20%. It improves water use efficiency, meaning it saves at least 4 to 5 numbers of irrigation. It has no side effects, meaning it is carbon friendly technology. Now some suggestions from farmers. Water pricing or fixed seasonal rate. This is one of the most important factor to disseminate the large scale dissemination of this technology, because farmers do not get any incentives although they used reduced amount of water. Another is knowledge gap, but the condition is improving day by day due to government intervention. Another important factor is knowledge gap. They do not know actually the benefit of this technology. So on a training field day, on use training field day is required for minimizing the knowledge gap. Another is media coverage. Media play an important role to telecast the benefit of AWD technology to make it motivate the farmers. Finally, government interventions. Now the government, it should be noted that this technology already is under our national policy in 2009. Based on the farmers' opinions, we conducted several training, field visit, and workshop. This is the some pictorial view of this training, field and field visit. Now the fisher research, we have a plan to reduce fisher's GHG emissions by using climate smart agriculture, meaning imported urea, quantifying of methane emission different agroecological zones of Bangladesh with varied soil conditions, screening of high-yielding rice varieties with reduced methane emissions, and finally use of biomass ash and biomass chalk to mitigate methane emissions. Now some achievements. We have published an international paper under AWD practice in northern part of Bangladesh in Mymensingh. Here we mention AWD practice reduced about 37% global warming potential compared to farmers' practice. My acknowledgement, I sincerely acknowledge with my institute, Bangladesh Rice Research Institute, USAID, International Fertilizer Development Center, CCSE, International Rice Research Institute, and finally Kishi Gobeshona Foundations. And this is all about my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Islam. That was something I am hoping I should ask the organizers about distribution of the slides, because there is so much content in there. I would love to go and look at some of that again. It was fascinating once. I'm sure I would enjoy it even more a second time. Thank you. That was great to see how these things are put into place on the ground and what the reception is of the farmers. I realized that I said after the country presenters, we would have two UNEP folks talk a little bit more, but I wonder if this might be a good time to actually jump back to hear a little bit from Alice Alpert, if she is willing, to go back and get some opening remarks before we continue with the more detailed technical discussion. So in the hopes that is agreeable to Alice, I will just note that Alice is a foreign affairs officer in the U.S. Department of State, and she has served as the CCAC focal point from the United States for the last few years. And so I think she has a few opening words to say here about methane and rice. So over to you, Alice, if that's all right.
Yes, thank you very much, Drew.
Wonderful.
Good morning. I mean, good afternoon, everyone. It's morning for me. I apologize for being a little bit late. There's just a little miscommunication. So thank you very much for letting me join you, and for CCAC's leadership in reducing short-lived climate pollutants, such long-standing leadership at this point. It's been 10 years almost. So as Drew said, I currently work for the U.S. Department of State, and I support Senior Director and White House Liaison Rick Duke in his role as CCAC co-chair on behalf of the U.S. government. And as I'm sure you know, the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, is relentlessly focused on keeping a safer 1.5 degree future within reach for all of us. And according to the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, methane accounts for roughly half of the current 1.0 degree Celsius warming that we're facing right now. And the CCAC's own global methane assessment, led by Dr. Drew Schindel right here, shows that rapid global methane reductions could avoid more than 0.2 degrees C of warming by 2050. And in fact, the entire world is recognizing now that methane is by far the top priority short-lived climate pollutant that we do need to tackle. So this is perfect timing. And in fact, in the near term, to keep 1.5 degrees within reach and prevent dangerous warming, the IPCC has found that deep methane reductions are as important as carbon dioxide reductions, which are also very important. Which brings me to rice. So rice feeds about a third of the world's population, so it is absolutely important for all of our futures. However, rice fields are a pretty significant source of methane, and I don't know if anyone has mentioned this before, but it's like 8 to 11% of global anthropogenic methane emissions. However, between a quarter and a third of the potential emissions that could be abated in 2030 can be done at zero cost. And around half of them can be done at a $20 break-even price. So we have a lot of options, as I'm sure that we will hear. And the US government, the US Department of Agriculture and the Agricultural Research Service are doing a lot of research on rice cultivation methods and how to reduce methane from them. So the US looks forward to continuing to engage in the CCAC's agricultural initiative to facilitate country-specific policies as well and regulations to address these emissions. That's it for me at the moment, but thank you for letting me join at this time.
Thank you, Alice, for those remarks. And it is really very helpful to get that context and to see the U.S. leadership in this space. And you would be happy to see that the US-EU-led pledge was mentioned by our colleague, Dr. Nia from Vietnam, about something that their country is potentially thinking about as well. So that leadership has been very helpful around the world. Terrific. So we are back on schedule and nicely on time as well. We've had our 2 country participants after the introduction. We now have 2 more speakers where we will hear next from Marcy Baranski, who is at UNEP's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, where she is managing climate smart rice projects in Myanmar, Pakistan, and Thailand. And before joining UNEP, she was at the US Department of Agriculture, where she was a climate change specialist in the office of the chief economist there. She's also done reviews on greenhouse gas inventories for UNFCCC, so is very well placed to talk to us today about monitoring, reporting, and verification. So thank you for joining us, Marcy, and over to you next.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So yeah, I only recently joined UNEP, and so I'm going to be wearing a few different hats today, speaking as a representative of UNEP, but also about my former experience as a member of the US Department of Agriculture and working on greenhouse gas improvements for agriculture, and then also my role as an expert reviewer for greenhouse gas inventories for the UNFCCC. And all of this really comes together with the work that UNEP is doing with CCAC on low emissions rice. And as Drew mentioned, we are working on a project in Thailand and Pakistan, currently working on MRV and scoping on how to finance the scaling up of low emissions rice. So I'm going to talk about MRV today, given my background with the inventory review and inventory improvements. With that said, I will say I'm not a representative of the UNFCCC, so some of the process questions that you might have, I'm not the best person to answer, but more just speaking from my own experience. So the reason that we have MRV is measurement or monitoring, reporting and verification is really to build transparency. And that transparency is all about building trust and seeing if we're actually achieving our objectives that are laid out in NDCs or national policy to reduce methane. So as you may know, the M for measurement is measuring the specific effects of national mitigation actions and providing those in a national inventory report. R, reporting those through national communications and biennial update reports. And V, verification through the international expert review of the biennial update reports for non-Annex 1 countries. Now, the process is changing for countries that have joined the Paris Agreement. These BURs will be replaced by a biennial transparency report as part of the enhanced transparency framework. So that's why I'll be focusing on these issues because there will be increased review of these greenhouse gas inventories and really a need to increase that transparency and support these MRV activities. So just addressing each at a time and how it relates to rice and how national governments can increase their capacity. On the measurement side, we really need that national data to measure, to track those practices and translate those into emissions estimates for mitigation. So specifically, you would use those IPCC guidelines. Those can help you determine the most appropriate method for your national circumstances. And then from there, you can assess what are your data needs based on those methods or some of the available tools, such as the tools from ERIE or the ALU tool. So for tracking AWD, you at minimum would need the area of land under these different irrigation regimes to be documented. So you may do this through a national survey or some other way, but in order to actually measure that change, you need the data of that area of land under the different regimes. Now, some countries might take the approach of if you generally know that the water regimes in the country and you know that only a specific project area, say, is practicing AWD, then you use the, subtract. You could just account separately from that area under AWD. So that's a good way to estimate those mitigation practices if you know that they're only being practiced in a certain area. Now, emission factors are also the important part of those estimation efforts. So developing those country-specific emission factors for rice is really important if you want to have a more accurate greenhouse gas inventory that's really reflecting your national circumstances. So my advice there is really use those international protocols for doing those measurements under those different ecosystems and water regimes, because as an inventory reviewer, that's one of the first things that I look at is what is the emission factor compared to similar countries under similar circumstances. And these emission factors should also be rigorously documented in a transparent way through national reports and peer-reviewed literature. And finally, the institutional arrangements in your government should support this regular data collection, analysis, and management. So from my experience with the Department of Agriculture, I know that coordination was really important with the Environmental Protection Agency. And I know that that can sometimes be a challenge. You have two different ministries that are operating under different principles, but it's so important to convene regular meetings between these agencies, the statistical agencies, and also the research institutions in your country. And also engaging those external stakeholders, such as industry and producer groups, NGOs, and universities or other research centers can also be a good source of data. They can provide review of your greenhouse gas inventories to really improve and give you good feedback on those numbers, those emissions estimates. So moving on to reporting, for countries that, as I said, have joined the Paris Agreement, we'll have the Enhanced Transparency Framework, which means that by the end of 2024, countries should be reporting a biennial transparency report instead of a BUR. And this will include a greenhouse gas inventory. And the point I want to make here is that a consistent quality greenhouse gas inventory will really enhance your tracking of that NDC progress. So it's just really important to build up those national institutional arrangements so that you can produce a regular greenhouse gas inventory that you can use then also to track your NDCs. Then finally, on the verification, the biennial transparency reports, including the greenhouse gas inventory, will undergo expert review. I'm not sure exactly what the schedule of that will be, but there will be an incredible need for new experts to be part of that review process. And my experience here as both a former government staff and as an inventory reviewer is that it's really helpful to approach this review as a tool, a way to improve your reporting and transparency, not seeing it as something adversarial or, just, I don't know, but seeing it as a way to discover those areas that are in need of improvement, areas that you need to finance or need some technology transfer and capacity building. And one thing I didn't mention earlier is I really recommend joining regional networks for improving these MRV processes, because every country that's joined the Paris Agreement or is part of the UNFCCC is going through this. So there's really a lot you can learn from those other governments and how they're arranging their institutional arrangements and also how they're estimating their emissions, what sort of how they're collecting the data, how they're processing the data, and how they're improving over time. So the point I will leave you with here is that it's really good to have some of your country staff to become an expert reviewer. You just gain so much experience in learning what are the inventory requirements, what are the methods, and what are the review procedures, and really why the review is happening. So it also supports the MRV processes and implementation of the Paris Agreement. And as I said, there will be a great demand for new reviewers as part of the Enhanced Transparency Framework. And right now, actually, the UNFCCC is currently inviting national focal points in developing countries to nominate 3 national experts to enroll in a training on the IPCC 2006 method. So please take advantage of that. So my concluding points, change here. Okay. My concluding points are that strengthening your institutional arrangements for MRV will really enhance your transparency and improve the processes of leading to that greenhouse gas inventory and national reporting for your NDCs. That it's really great to collaborate with other countries through forums like this, but also, building relationships offline, attending some of those regional events. And maybe it's just working with one other country that has similar circumstances to your own. And then finally, just remember a greenhouse gas inventory, it's not meant to be perfect. It's always expected that there will be improvements over time. And so, like I said, really take advantage of the feedback that you get from those review sessions and don't see them as a criticism of something related to your country, but rather a chance to improve and look for those resources that can help you with your reporting. And I have some resources that I'm happy to share later. So I will end here. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Marcy. That was a great presentation and a nice complement to the country level work on implementation is the work on what is not monitoring, but measuring. Good to get what the M stands for correct in my head finally. Nice to think of how that might relate to the global methane pledge that came up as well. I think it will have many uses as we improve our inventories for UNFCCC and elsewhere. So terrific. We've had 3 very nice and diverse presentations. We have, as I mentioned at the beginning, a 4th guest. That is James Lomax, who is a food system and agricultural systems advisor at UNEP in the ecosystem division, and also has been working with the Secretariat of the UN Food Systems Summit. He has spent a lot of time thinking about systems thinking and systems of systems within food and agriculture, where nutrition, waste, and environmental externalities are all considered together rather than thinking of one thing at a time. So we are thrilled to have you join us as well, James, as well as all of the other speakers who will form our panel for the remainder of the discussion. James, did you want to say a few words before we go straight into the panel discussion? You're welcome to have a few minutes of your own as well.
Yeah, fine. I think I will very briefly. What I just wanted to say, I think, was that one thing I did do, Drew, which isn't in my bio, which of course is very pertinent, is that I started the Sustainable Rice Platform 10, 11 years ago, and I see on the panelist list quite a few colleagues that were on that journey with me. So while these days it's not a lot of my work, I very much am proud, if you like, of the work that we did on the Sustainable Rice Platform, which is really a public-private venture to work out what sustainability means in the rice sector, and in specifically, yes, methane reduction was, if you like, the entry point, Drew, but we also know that if we do that, then it's an incredible opportunity to work on the other 2 planetary crises too, which are pollution and which is nature and biodiversity loss. So anything that we discuss, I think, when it comes from a UNEP perspective, while methane may be, if you like, the headline grabber when it comes to rice, we've also got to look at, due to the fact that it is that there are 144 million smallholders, it's not only methane that we have to look at. We have to look at, if we are going to go down the alternate wet and drying route, what opportunities exist there to reduce nitrogen, excess nitrogen going into the atmosphere and into the environment. What is it that we have to do to bring biodiversity back to wetlands? And I think there are some fantastic examples where, by going in via a methane reduction route, we can also then look at the co-benefits of taking a sustainability approach too. So that's, if you like, the angle that we bring in from UNEP, that while methane is important, of course it is, there are other as important elements that we can achieve and impacts that we can address by taking a sustainability approach as laid out in the Sustainable Rice Platform Standard. Thank you.
Terrific, James. Thank you. And I think that segues nicely into some of the results that we saw from Dr. Islam, for example, which were the deep planting of urea to reduce runoff as well as other things. So I think that actually is a great lead-in to one of the opening questions that I wanted to present to the panel, which is, we have these changes in practice. For example, the UDP, the urea displacement, we have alternate wetting and drying, we have all kinds of things that we have seen from the country presentations can be done. How do these then help enhance food system sustainability in the larger context that we just heard about from James? Are there any downsides, or is this all moving us in the right direction for enhancing sustainability writ large? So maybe that would go first to Dr. Nia from Vietnam, and then we'll hear maybe from Dr. Islam about the Bangladesh point of view.
Thank you.
So, can you repeat the question again? Sorry.
And no problem. Yes, I was probably too long of a way of putting it. How do these solutions that reduce emissions from rice also enhance food system sustainability, or do they enhance food system sustainability?
Yes, because of you can see from my presentation, we have the list of long list of different mitigation options. And we analyze this. You can see from the 7 different criteria. One of this is about the co-benefits, because in Vietnam, a lot of our farmer is a very small farmer. We have about 10 million different small farmers. So we are not putting the burden to the small farmer or the poor farmer. So that is going to be, you can see one of the measures we call 1 mass fire reduction. 1 mass is that you need to use the certified seed, and fire reduction is reducing the chemical pesticide, fertilizer, and reducing the water use and such and such. So that is also enhancing the food system towards the food safety, and also the we call it towards the more environmental friendly types of the food produced. And we will go along also with the processing, using the different types of the residuals, for instance, using the rice husks or straw to dry the rice before we go to the mill in the rice. So reducing, also try to reducing the food loss along the value chain. And that is maybe answer some of the question. Back to you, Drew.
Yes, that does. Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned reducing food loss as well. There are things, there are additional co-benefits, as we saw, avoiding burning, which leads to air pollution. Food loss is another prime source of methane emissions as that food decomposes. So there are a lot of things. I wanted to follow up very briefly with Dr. Islam. And in your presentation, you indicated that there were yield increases, and again, as we just heard, reduced water demands, and no side effects, I believe was the phrasing. Are there really no downsides at all? And for example, I have heard that alternate wetting and drying can lead to increased in weeds and invasive plants. Does that ever an issue, or is this really all upside and all beneficial?
Okay, thank you for your nice questions. I mentioned AWD has no side effects. Actually,
Right.
meaning I indicate meaning is this is the regarding environmental issue. AWD, AWD is a very good technology in Bangladesh, not in Bangladesh, in the world. Along with it, increase water use efficiency. It increase fertilizer use efficiency due to aerobic and anaerobic condition. We know rice plant prefer both ammonium and nitrate. When we dry the soil, rice plant take nitrate NO3. When we irrigate, rice plant take NH4. That means if we follow AWD, rice plant take both ammonium and nitrate. That is very good. But in case of irrigation practice in Bangladesh, particularly northern part of Bangladesh, due to continuous suction of groundwater, our water level is very low down. So this is the threat for us. But if we maintain AWD, at least if we maintain modified AWD, not perfect AWD, in our country, most of the farmers, they dry the soil automatically, but they do not follow the PVC pipe. That is the informal AWD. That is the AWD, modified AWD, not formal. In case of it has no side effect, meaning except weeds that you mentioned, except weed, I think it has no side effect. But weed intensity is not so much high. If we dry the soil 2 times, not more than more time. If we dry the soil 1 or 2 times, I think weed is not a big factor. Factor is fertilizer use efficiency, water use efficiency. That is the good factor. In another most important issue is climate change impact. That is it significantly reduces methane emission. That is the very positive to climate. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to follow that up with a related question, which is something that I had planned to ask the panel, is what kind of strategies are most effective when you are going out into the practitioners, into the farmers, and trying to advocate for these new production technologies. But I think it can also be thought of as a question that came in the chat from Bjorn Sander from International Rice Research Institute, which is, could we put the question the other way around? How can mitigation co-benefits be achieved through dissemination of improved practices? So maybe for the country practitioners or James, what is the most successful way to go out and reach farmers? Do you say, hey, you should be more sustainable, and then you'll get a bunch of great co-benefits as well? Or do you say, hey, these are all the things you care about, avoiding nitrogen runoff and avoiding, increasing your yields. And by the way, that also, the way to do that is to be more sustainable. Which kind of approach, or maybe it's neither of those, but what works well to overcome barriers to just doing it the way we've always done it? James, do you want to weigh in first?
Yeah, I really could, but I'd very much like to hear from the other people on the call, because the other panelists, because this is something that I've really been thinking about a lot in the last few years, and Ole will probably know this because we've spoken about it before. You actually asked a question. So I think I'm not sure this really works when you address farmers one by one, because farmers live in a landscape and they live in a policy environment. And my experience is that if you really want to work with multiple or change multiple practices across a landscape, you either have to, well, you have to do two things. The first of all is that you have to look at how water arrives and is managed at the farm level. It may well be that farmer 1 wants to do something, but farmer 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 don't, and therefore, if they're all on the same irrigation system, then of course, you know, there's not much that farmer 1 can actually do about it. So first of all, look at the landscape level, and specifically, what are the efficiencies and what are the incentives that can be seen at the landscape level? Is it the fact that there'll be less money going into water management, or in fact, is it that the landscape itself could be rewarded for its methane mitigation, or is it in fact that that landscape itself could be rewarded for less nutrients going into the water by a user downstream? These are things that we have to look at, and then you take that up a level and you look at the country level, and you have to say, okay, fine, so what is it? What is the policy landscape like in which farmers operate? And we know, and one of the reasons that when we started the Sustainable Rice platform, people were quite, you know, they were shaking their head thinking, gosh, this is a very tricky thing for UNEP to work on because it's a very political crop. I think we have to look at the policy landscape at the country level. What is it that's driving people? And that could be both things. That could be kind of the carrot part of it. So how do you create the demand for different change? So incentivizing, but it can also be the other issue, like, you know, regulation, where, for example, because water is simply free, there's no incentive to go down that particular route. Right, and that's very much the case in Pakistan, where we had work in the Punjabi region where we were trying to work out why water use efficiency was so inefficient. And it was because water was completely free, and also fuel for the pumps was subsidized. Now, don't quote me on it, please. And I'm sure if there's a Pakistani person on here, maybe I've got it wrong. But it was just an example that stuck in my mind for levers from a policy point of view that governments can actually push to just create that incentive for change. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I would like to return in a moment to some of those levers. But first, I wanted to just see if anybody else on the panel had a comment on this. You know, which kind of thing leads and which follows? What is the most appealing to a farmer? Is it their own yield? Is it their sustainable practices? Is it the co-benefits? Which is most helpful in convincing them that the way they've always done it might be worth rethinking?
Can I have some
Please,
discussion?
Yeah,
I think I completely agree with James about looking at the policy landscape. For instance, in Vietnam, the water is free, but so the farmer is there, but the field is so small, it's not worth to go to, like, let's say, at least the dryness a couple of times during the season. So we are planning, like, working with the IRRI to develop the suitable map based on the different areas, different regions, and different seasons. For instance, in the north, in the Red River Delta, we have to have combining the use of the water from irrigation water with the hydropower plant. So the water is not released all the time. So we have the schedule to work between so that using the water effectively for the irrigation and for the electrical generation. So that it means that we have not the water providing the water for irrigation the couple of times during the season. That is the fitting into the dryness or the irrigated time. And so we can apply the most is more applicable is the mid season dryness instead of full AWD, because that is the one difficult. For the AWD, the government has the policy, maybe work throughout the extension system or working with the businesses. They have the contract farmers. So during the guides for the technical guides to apply the procedure to producing rice, so that they have the local, we call the farmer friends, to work with the farmers, so following the protocol, production protocol, including the AWD or some kinds of the mitigation measures to encourage them, or at least asking them to follow those measures. Back to you, Drew.
Thank you. So I think we are entering some very interesting areas here, and I'm really enjoying this discussion of how to interact when you have so many small players. You know, much of the time I have been involved in methane discussions, it's how do you get 5 giant multinational fossil fuel companies who are the main sources in a particular country. But when you get to Bangladesh and Vietnam, it's these tens of thousands of individual farmers. So one follow-up question then I would like to ask again for anybody who has this thoughts about this is we're hearing about some of the ways to influence behavior, and what Dr. Nia was just saying from Vietnam, there were words like encourage farmers to do this and try to convince them to do this. And we have a comment in the chat from Benjamin Runkle about, in the US, much of the incentive comes from water conservation, where there is, water is not free, unlike James's example of Pakistan, right? Water is not at all free. And so that's a way you can encourage people. Do we have comments or thoughts about, I guess my question is really, how much can we get done by education and encouragement, and how much really requires either a strict government regulation? There was another comment in the chat from Ola Sanderson about, we cannot put an emissions cap on farmers. That, I think, is a very fair point. We could do things like the US does and charge more for water. We could give credits, carbon credits for methane emissions reductions. We could give payments to incentivize, minimizing the use of fertilizer, right? There are economic or regulatory levers we could push, or we could simply encourage and educate and try to convince farmers that it's in their own best interest for the sake of their yields and their soil health, etc. Thoughts about what kind of things actually work, and is it context dependent? Is there a kind of more one size fits all? Does it vary from place to place of how much economic or regulatory leverage is needed versus education and voluntary? So open to the floor. I can see most of you if you want to raise hands or just chime in.
I can.
Thank you. So, Marcy, please go for it.
Okay. So everything in agriculture is context dependent. That's the message I always want to leave people with. It's out of, the all of the processes in the economy that lead to emissions. It's one of the few biological processes. So it's always messy, it's always context dependent. And most mitigation practices in agriculture have some sort of trade-off, maybe with yield, maybe with cost. And luckily, alternate wetting and drying is one that really does seem to work in most irrigated contexts, I'll say. So you do have to keep in mind that farmers do need access to reliable irrigation that they can turn on and off. And so there are some challenges there, but that's where most of the emissions are coming from, is in rice, it's the flooded rice. It's not so much the upland rice. I think in terms of smallholder farmers, it has to be all about incentives and things that work for them, things that increase their income. So again, fortunately, AWD seems to really show that it does increase their resilience, it can increase their income, and when coupled with these other sustainable rice practices, the farmers that we're working with in Myanmar, they're using less inputs, but they're still getting the same or increased yield. So they're really increasing their income there. But certainly some of the structural issues, like James mentioned, if water is free, there's not much incentive unless you could come at it from the other co-benefits. Yeah, certainly I think the role for government in rice is more of in that setting the institutional framework that allows farmers to adopt these practices rather than say a regulatory focus. But it is obviously country to country. There's different situations.
Thank you, Marcy. Anyone else want to chime in on this topic? There's a comment in the chat as well that says there's talk of a tax on methane emissions starting at around $800 per ton. Do any panelists have strong views on the potential of this approach? I have a sense from what Marcy just said that applying that to smallholder farmers would not be necessarily the wisest choice.
No, and I think that's true. That's really not practical. You know, that's really not practical. It might be practical in the context of, say, a large rice farmer in the US or you know, Spain, whatever. But it's not really the case. It's not going to be the case in the majority of the rice growing regions that we have, of course, that happen to be in Asia and a little bit in Africa. But look, I just wonder. I've always felt that there's an opportunity when it comes to rice, due to the fact that you have a relative homogeneity in the way that farmers are producing in a particular landscape. And if that is the case, then I believe that we can look at landscape indicators, we can use technology from maybe satellite imagery, etc., to sort of see when you get to the monitoring point of view, Marcy, that you spoke about, to kind of, if you like, take it from the boots on the ground to a much more kind of just at a landscape level, if you like, to kind of look at, in fact, whether certain practices are being employed. So I think there needs to be a mindset change. I think countries have the ability to do that, but there is always, and this is something that I've really had right from the start, is that it's all very well to talk about sustainability if we can guarantee yields. And I think once we've got to really bang that drum about the fact that if we do AWD, or if we do reduce top dressing of nitrogen, etc., 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 you are going to be in a situation where yield may go down, but it's going to stabilize and going to come back up again. And therefore, countries have to say, right, where do we want to get to? And if there is a decrease in the yield, those farmers, that transition from conventional to more sustainable has to be funded and acknowledged at some point, because the knee-jerk reaction from governments about sustainable rice, I think that I've heard is, well, yeah, that's fine, but we have to make sure that we get the same volumes of rice that we need to feed our population. So it's a very real trade-off or discussion you have to have.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting that the satellite data could help monitor land use and such. It could also potentially begin to help monitor some of the emissions. I think that rice tends to be dispersed over too large of an area for the current generation, but maybe at some point that will come in as well. And then as far as the international community acknowledging that, that plays nicely into what Marcy was talking about with, reporting of different emissions. And of course, we definitely have the international community is on board for tracking countries' progress towards climate goals. We don't necessarily have such clear, neatly defined either goals or reporting requirements for some of these other things like, local nitrogen runoff. But for at least the kind of methane change that would come out from greater adoption of alternate wetting and drying, in principle, if that shows up in the inventories, there would be a way for that to be acknowledged by the world community. It's less clear to me, at least, how exactly the world community might help with funding to support a transition. Maybe that's expertise in education and best practices, like we're hearing from Bangladesh and Vietnam about how to move these things forward. I want to take one more comment from Dr. Nia on this one.
I think it's one of with the small farmer, is usually the policy landscape. We're looking at the two sides of the coin. Is also the penalty also rewarding. If the small farmer, they are following the mitigation option, and then they will be rigorous. So in this consumer side, even the education or awareness raising, we're also looking at the consumer education. So if we apply the technology and we brand name or the label with the products, climate change responsible products, so if they can get some kind of premium for or rewarding for the applying the mitigation in the methane for particular, then it's also, I think, it's the on the ways of the policy can looking at, because I don't think it was because now when we see the European country start discussing about the carbon border tax, farmer in Vietnam start worrying about that, because how we can be able to transfer making the information transfer communication of the practices, mitigation practices that is following the low carbon production, so that you can at least avoid the carbon border tax when rice of Vietnam get into the European market. So, and also, as I mentioned, it's not fair to put the burden of the mitigation reduction of the greenhouse gas emission on the small farmer and the poor farmer. So I think also we're looking at both in the supply side and the demand side of the equation. Back to you, Drew.
Yes, thank you. Hopefully I feel a little bit optimistic about this, that unlike, say, manufactured goods, which are going to emit a lot of CO2, and you might be putting the burden on the wrong person. It seems like everybody would win if we shift practices to improve food system sustainability, and then the rice could be imported to the European market, and the local farmers in Vietnam or Bangladesh or wherever would come out ahead by having to all of the co-benefits that we talked about. So I just wanted to also acknowledge there were some interesting other points raised in the chat there, which I see Marcy has also just responded to, that yes, it's not just government putting a price on incentives or charging for water, but also government subsidies that currently distort the market. And that's another avenue for improvement and reform. That was, for me anyway, a fascinating chat. I really want to thank everybody for that panel discussion. I have a lot of new ideas to go and think about, and I like the way that we are talking about making change on the ground that's good for farmers, that's good for the planet, and that can feed into larger activities like monitoring and reporting in UNFCCC. So thank you all for joining. It was a pleasure, and the recording of the webinar and the slides will all be distributed afterwards. We have a couple other webinars on methane coming up, CCAC is hosting, and I encourage you to join those as well if you have time. Thanks again for all your participation, everybody.
Thank you, Drew.
Thank you.